Barron Trump had always been somewhat of an enigma. From the moment he was born into the spotlight as the youngest son of Donald and Melania Trump, the public took an interest in him but never quite got to know him. While his siblings, Junior, Ivanka, Eric, and even Tiffany took active roles in politics or business, Barron remained silent, shielded from the noise. His presence at political events was rare, and even when he appeared, he was distant, polite, but unreadable. As a teenager, he avoided social media, public interviews, and the family business altogether, which only deepened the intrigue surrounding him. After Donald Trump left the White House, the family splintered into different public and private paths. Ivanka moved to Florida and distanced herself from the political arena, while Donald Jr. doubled down on conservative media. Eric returned to his business ventures, and Tiffany kept a relatively low profile. Barron, however, almost disappeared from public view entirely. While the tabloids occasionally speculated about his height, his schooling, or his rumored interests, there was very little concrete information. Some said he was studying law or computer science. Others claimed he had no interest in politics whatsoever. What became clear over time was that Barron was taking a very different route than the rest of his family. He reportedly enrolled in an elite East Coast university under a pseudonym. Professors, under strict confidentiality, later described a student who was observant, methodical, and strikingly reserved. There was no arrogance, no name. He rarely even acknowledged who his father was. Most of his classmates didn't realize who he was until weeks into the semester. He seemed to want nothing more than to be treated like a normal young man. But being a Trump meant that normal would always be relative. While the Trump name opened doors, it also brought pressure and scrutiny. There were expectations that Barron would eventually pick a side. Some speculated that he would become a quiet advisor to his father behind the scenes. Others believed he would publicly denounce the family name and chart a new course, but neither happened. Barron remained silent. His silence wasn't just a lack of words, it was a deliberate choice, and that choice became its own kind of statement. Insiders close to the family began to whisper that Barron had taken on the role of observer within the Trump dynasty. He was the one watching the chessboard from a distance while the others moved the pieces. When Donald Trump launched his second campaign, Barron didn't appear on stage. When the indictments rolled in, he made no statements. When Melania returned to the public eye for select appearances, Barron stayed behind. It wasn't that he was uninformed, quite the opposite. Those who knew him described someone deeply interested in law, history, and privacy rights. He spent hours reading case law and legal journals, often engaging in late-night debates with professors or peers about constitutional boundaries, the limits of executive power, and the definition of classified information. He wasn't trying to be a politician or a showman. He wanted to understand the system. That knowledge came into focus one Thursday afternoon, when a televised panel discussion caught his attention. As usual, Barron had been watching alone, on his laptop in a Manhattan apartment that was modest. By Trump standards, the discussion wasn't initially different from others, a round table of politicians and pundits, arguing over the legacy of Donald Trump. But when Representative Jasmine Crockett began speaking, Barron leaned in. It wasn't what she said about the Trump presidency that caught his attention. It was the mention of names, locations, and financial details that, to his trained ears, were tied to sealed court records. Most people watching at home might have dismissed her claims as political theater, but Barron heard something else: specificity. Certain key words, phrasing, and timelines that aligned with confidential information he had once read while reviewing legal archives during his studies. In that moment, he wasn't watching as a son. He was watching as someone who had spent years quietly studying the law, and something didn't sit right. Up until that moment, he had remained almost invisible to the public eye. He hadn't spoken out during his father's presidency, hadn't commented on controversies, and hadn't tried to shift public opinion. But when he believed a line had been crossed, not in politics, but in legality, he acted, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with the same measured, deliberate nature that had defined his years in silence. For the first time, Barron Trump wasn't just observing the headlines, he was about to step into one. The panel discussion was billed as just another political segment, tucked between breaking news stories and election forecasts. It was scheduled for a late afternoon broadcast on one of the major networks, with the usual mix of analysts, commentators, and a rotating roster of lawmakers. On that particular day, Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas was a featured guest. Known for her unfiltered approach and willingness to challenge the status quo, she had become a familiar face on television, often praised by some and criticized by others for her blunt delivery and bold claims. The conversation began predictably: analysis of the 2024 election aftermath, projections for congressional races, and discussions of ongoing investigations involving former President Donald Trump. But then, without warning, Crockett shifted the tone. The studio's lighting hadn't changed. The host hadn't prompted her, but her voice lowered just slightly as she leaned forward. The camera zoomed in. Viewers across the country perked up as she said, Let's stop dancing around the truth. I've seen what most of you haven't. Asterisk, she went on to describe what she claimed were previously undisclosed financial dealings tied to the Trump organization during the 1990s and early 2000s. She mentioned shell corporations, off-the-record meetings, and questionable wire transfers. The most striking part wasn't just the content, it was the confidence with which she delivered it. She didn't hedge her words. She claimed, without flinching, that she had seen confidential records and had access to sealed testimonies implicating Donald Trump and certain business associates in conduct that, as she phrased it, would have sent most people to prison a long time ago. Asterisk, the host, visibly stunned, tried to interject. Congresswoman, are you saying you viewed sealed documents? Asterisk, Crockett didn't backpedal. I'm saying what needs to be said. The American people deserve to know who they've been voting for, and I won't sit back and protect secrets that only serve the powerful. Asterisk, it was a bold declaration. Within seconds, clips were being shared online. Social media exploded with hashtags like #TrumpSecrets and #CrockettLeaks. Supporters hailed her bravery while critics called it reckless. But in a quiet corner of Manhattan, Barron Trump was watching with a very different reaction. Asterisk, he hadn't planned to watch this segment live. The program was background noise, a routine part of his afternoon, often muted while he worked on school assignments or read through case studies. But when he heard Jasmine Crockett say she had accessed sealed court testimonies, he paused. He turned up the volume. The more she spoke, the more his posture shifted. His attention sharpened. The names she mentioned weren't random. The events weren't generalizations. They lined up almost too perfectly with matters he had studied in private. Asterisk, though he had never been part of his father's inner political circle, Barron had spent years trying to understand how politics, media, and law intersected, especially when it came to the blurred line between public accountability and legal confidentiality. What Crockett was doing wasn't just political commentary. He believed it was a potential violation of federal confidentiality protections. Asterisk, what disturbed Barron most wasn't that she was attacking his father. He had grown used to that. What stood out was that she was making statements that implied she had either illegally obtained access to sealed federal court material or was referencing information protected by law without citing any appropriate channel of disclosure. To Barron, that wasn't just bold, it was dangerous. Asterisk, Crockett's demeanor on camera made it clear that she wasn't bluffing. She spoke with a calmness that suggested she had thought this through, or at least believed she had enough cover to say what she did without facing legal consequences. That, to Barron, made it all the more serious. This wasn't a misstep or a misquote. It was intentional. And that carried weight. Asterisk, he watched the rest of the segment unfold in near silence. The host kept trying to rein her in, asking whether legal consequences concerned her. She responded coolly, they should be more concerned about what's in those files than who's reading them. Asterisk, it was a statement meant to provoke, and it did. But for Barron Trump, it did something more. It triggered a calculated response. He wasn't concerned about political fallout or public backlash. He was thinking in legal terms, in constitutional boundaries, in the ethical handling of classified or sealed information. Watching that segment, he saw a line being just a political one, but a legal one. One that, in his view, couldn't go unanswered. Asterisk. As Barron Trump sat in his Manhattan apartment, the buzz of the television still echoing in the background, his mind raced. He wasn't known for reacting impulsively. He had always been the kind of person who took time to absorb things before making a move. But the moment Jasmine Crockett uttered those words that hinted at private court documents and sealed financial records, something shifted in him. It wasn't emotion that overtook him, not anger or indignation. It was something colder, sharper, the realization that a line had been crossed, and no one else seemed to recognize it. He replayed the segment 3 times. Each time he listened, more carefully, catching every nuance in Crockett's tone, every name she invoked, every date she mentioned. It wasn't just that she had made accusations against his father. That was common, and frankly expected at this point. But what stood out to Barron was her precise language. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't speculating. She was referencing details that were, to his knowledge, never made public. Dates of wire transfers, property names tied to obscure holding companies, a reference to an old deposition that had been sealed as part of a court agreement. These weren't just random tidbits a staffer might stumble across. This was inside material. Asterisk, Barron's knowledge of these matters didn't come from family gossip or business meetings. It came from his own self-guided education. Over the past few years, he had quietly developed an interest in legal structure, especially how courts handled sealed records, classified testimony, and privilege law. He had taken courses in privacy law and constitutional boundaries. He had pored over federal case law, not for any assignment, but because he wanted to understand how power worked behind the curtain. And because of that, he knew what was supposed to stay confidential and how dangerously close Crockett was sailing to that edge. Asterisk, most people watching the broadcast wouldn't have caught it. They would have seen a politician making bold statements, trying to energize her base. But to Barron, who had quietly kept tabs on the legal threads surrounding his family for years, this wasn't a casual segment. This was, in his mind, an open challenge to confidentiality laws and court protections. Asterisk, he could have called a lawyer. He could have sent a text to one of his father's former aides. But he didn't. Instead, he took a more formal route. Asterisk, he pulled out his phone, opened his secure contacts, and placed a call to a federal agency office he had bookmarked weeks ago, not because he ever thought he'd need it, but because he believed in being prepared. The operator answered. Barron spoke with clarity, calmly describing what he had witnessed and explaining why he believed federal privacy and disclosure laws might have been violated on live television. Asterisk, the agent on the other end asked his name. When he said it, there was a pause. Asterisk, Barron Trump. Asterisk, yes. Asterisk, silence followed for a few seconds. Not disbelief, more like surprise. Barron was used to that reaction. Most people didn't expect him to be engaged, much less involved in something so specific. But he wasn't calling as the son of a former president. He was calling as a private citizen who had just watched something he believed demanded legal review. Asterisk, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't beg for action. He simply reported what he had seen, cited the applicable federal statute that prohibits the disclosure of confidential information, and left it in their hands. Asterisk, by the time the call ended, he felt no satisfaction, no adrenaline, just focus. If Crockett had documents she wasn't supposed to have, or if she was publicly sharing sealed material, there needed to be a process to address that. It didn't matter that she was a member of Congress. It didn't matter that public opinion might swing in her favor. The law, as Barron understood it, wasn't supposed to bend based on popularity. Asterisk, later that evening, he sat alone watching the media react. The talking heads speculated wildly. Had Crockett really revealed something illegal? Was she bluffing? Was it protected speech? Most people were debating political implications. Barron wasn't interested in that. His concern was narrower but more serious. If public officials could freely cite confidential documents on live television without consequence, what else could be breached? And in that moment, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. News of Barron Trump's quiet call to authorities didn't leak right away. That wasn't surprising. He had gone through secure, formal channels, his message carefully worded, devoid of family defense or partisan tone. But within 48 hours of Jasmine Crockett's broadcast, the wheels behind the scenes began to turn. Legal analysts on cable networks began dissecting her statements, and some former prosecutors raised concerns about the legality of what she had revealed. Was this a case of whistleblowing, or had she exposed sealed content in violation of federal law? Asterisk, Barron watched as the media frenzy grew, though he didn't engage with it. Not on social media, not through interviews. He maintained the silence that had defined him for so many years. But silence didn't mean disengagement. He kept close tabs on the situation, not from a place of vengeance, but from an insistence on accountability, something he had come to value in a world where names like his seemed to warp the rules. Asterisk, then came the unexpected twist. Asterisk, within a week of the broadcast, Jasmine Crockett was contacted by federal investigators. The inquiry wasn't public, but leaks surfaced quickly. Anonymous sources from Capitol Hill suggested the Department of Justice had questions about the source of her information. Crockett, unapologetic, made a brief statement on her way into a closed-door session. The truth should never be illegal. It was a powerful soundbite, one that quickly went viral. Her supporters rallied, calling her a hero, a truth-teller, a fearless opponent of corruption. Hashtags supporting her surged across social platforms. Asterisk, but in the quieter corridors of legal analysis, opinions were more divided. Experts began discussing the boundaries of congressional immunity, the handling of classified or sealed documents, and the limits of free speech when it intersects with federal confidentiality laws. The debate spilled into OPDs, law school forums, and podcasts. Some accused Barron Trump, whose name by now had surfaced in connection to the original complaint, of political retaliation. Others praised him for drawing attention to a real, legal gray area that deserved clarification. Asterisk, still, Barron said nothing. He gave no public response to the speculation, but those who knew him weren't surprised. He had always been deliberate. If he was going to act again, it wouldn't be through an interview or a Twitter thread. It would be through official channels, or not at all. And then the story took a turn that even his quiet resolve couldn't have anticipated. Late one evening, his phone buzzed. It was a message from someone he hadn't spoken to in years. An old acquaintance from a youth leadership event he had attended as a teenager. Someone who now worked in a federal oversight committee. The message was brief. Heads up. This is getting bigger than you think. Stay low. Asterisk, Barron sat with the message for a while. It was vague, but not entirely surprising. Crockett's broadcast had turned from a political flashpoint into a legal dilemma. The larger question now looming over Washington was whether members of Congress were operating under assumed protection that the law didn't actually grant. And if Crockett had overstepped, intentionally or not, it could trigger a broader review of how classified or sealed information is handled by lawmakers. Asterisk, in some corners, talk began about establishing new boundaries. Legislative aides were reportedly instructed to review protocols on the handling of sealed materials. Certain congressional offices were asked to account for who had access to confidential briefings. Quietly, the incident had set off a chain reaction not because of the former president, but because his son, often overlooked and underestimated, had taken one careful, deliberate step that couldn't be ignored. Barron didn't follow the growing media circus. He stayed focused on the process. He reached out to a professor he trusted from his university's law department to discuss the evolving legal questions surrounding the incident. Not because he wanted guidance, but because he believed in understanding the implications of his own actions fully. If his report was going to make waves, he wanted to make sure they were waves grounded in principle, not politics. As days passed, the spotlight shifted away from Crockett's original claims and toward the broader questions her statements had she exposed wrongdoing, or had she undermined legal safeguards by invoking sealed material for dramatic effect? Either way, Barron had unintentionally ignited a debate that Washington hadn't been ready for. A debate not just about Trump's legacy, but about the responsibilities of those who wield public information. And though he still hadn't spoken publicly, everyone knew his fingerprints were on the shift. Not because he defended his father, but because he believed some rules should apply to everyone, even those who claim to speak for justice. In the end, the controversy surrounding Jasmine Crockett's televised remarks and Barron Trump's quiet intervention didn't resolve with a grand trial or a sweeping admission of guilt. There was no dramatic courtroom moment or tearful apology before cameras. Instead, what followed was something more enduring, a nationwide conversation about ethics, accountability, and the fine line between truth-telling and legal boundaries. It was the kind of dialogue that didn't end with a headline. It lingered, forcing institutions, lawmakers, and media figures to reflect on the power and limits of public speech. Jasmine Crockett remained defiant. Her supporters continued to hail her as a bold figure willing to speak hard truths in a culture that often rewards silence. But even as her popularity grew in certain circles, there was a noticeable shift in how members of Congress approached sensitive topics during media appearances. More caution, more legal consultation, quiet meetings with legal advisors before public interviews. It was clear that the line between advocacy and legal exposure had been brought into sharper focus. And then there was Barron. He never sought recognition for his actions. In fact, he went out of his way to avoid the spotlight that others were eager to cast on him. But in private circles, among law students, analysts, and constitutional scholars, his role was quietly acknowledged, not as the son of a former president, looking to settle scores, but as a young man who recognized that process matters, that even those who speak loudly about justice must also respect the legal frameworks that protect it. In an era dominated by spectacle and division, Barron Trump's decision to act not with a tweet, but with a carefully placed phone call, spoke volumes. It showed that influence doesn't always have to roar. Sometimes, it's most powerful when it moves quietly, guided not by emotion, but by reason. His actions didn't lead to Crockett's downfall, nor did he ask for them to, but he did force a moment of pause in a political culture that often rewards recklessness over restraint. Perhaps the most striking legacy of this story is the subtle shift it inspired not just in Washington, but among the broader public. People began asking tougher questions about the boundaries of transparency, about the dangers of leaking sensitive information, even when it feels justified, and about the responsibility that comes with having a platform. For Barron, this wasn't a defining moment of revenge or vindication. It was, simply, a moment of principle, a quiet reminder that the rule of law isn't a weapon or a structure, one that must remain intact, even when the people inside it disagree, shout, or clash in public view. In the months that followed, the noise of the headlines faded, the controversy settled into the archives of political memory, but the effects lingered, and somewhere, in the background, Barron Trump returned to his studies, watching, learning, and perhaps preparing for a world that was finally beginning to see him not just as a name, but as a presence.